there were many 2020s before 2020. There was in 2015, there was a few cities. Baltimore was one of them. And the riots you described that you were actually covering were in 2015 in Baltimore. And there were 2015 riots in Chicago. And then in 2018, there were another volley of, right? And then 2020 was the biggest one. I mean, 2020 was really where it became so widespread at one time. But in each of these events, locally and then nationally in 2020, we saw pressure against, like unprecedented pressure against law enforcement that led to these really, really difficult recruitment challenges that these cities face.
Outstanding is a production of The Washington Stand, your source for news and commentary from a biblical worldview.
Welcome to Outstanding, the podcast where we look at issues in the news and how they affect our lives from a biblical worldview. I'm Casey Harper with The Washington Stand, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Imagine you or a family member is the victim of a crime. Someone you love is robbed or even killed. Then you find out that the criminal in question had been arrested before, maybe even multiple times. Even worse, they should have been deported last year, but they weren't. And now you are paying the price. This may seem like an extraordinary story, but sadly it's not. This kind of story plays out all the time for countless Americans. For instance, in San Antonio, Texas, a Marine Corps veteran was allegedly shot by an illegal immigrant in May of this year. Turns out, the suspect had been arrested multiple times and released, not deported. How can this keep happening? A broken immigration system keeps illegal immigrants in the U.S., at least until the last few months when President Trump took over. Liberal prosecutors, often funded by donors like George Soros, but he's not the only one, they refuse to prosecute criminals, or they let them out with no bail, all in the name of equity, or sometimes without any reason at all. Meanwhile, cities have become less safe, and police departments are struggling to recruit new officers. Why would cops risk their lives to catch a criminal if that criminal will simply be let out of jail? We're going to get to the bottom of this, and here to help is Jason Johnson. He is president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund and a former police officer. Most recently, Jason served as the deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department. So he probably knows a little bit about crime and violent crime going on in Baltimore from 2016 to 2018, in addition to leading the Baltimore Strategic Services Bureau. Mr. Johnson also served as the chair of the Baltimore Police Performance Review Board. That means he was involved in a lot of reviews of police alleged misbehavior, and so he knows that process well as well. We also have here with us Sam McCarthy, reporter from the Washington Stand, who has been covering these issues in depth. All right, so Jason, I want to start with you. And just, this story we just referenced, are stories like this Marine example really true? Are criminals just committing crimes and then being let out of jail to do it again? And, oh, by the way, they should have been deported. How can that be?
Yes, Casey, unfortunately, I'm here to report it really is true. And the reasons for it are many. It's not just one singular reason. I know we'll dive into this over this podcast episode. But the long and short of it is that there are a growing number of public officials in various roles. They might be mayors, and an increasing number are prosecutors who view our criminal justice system in a way maybe different than we do. And that is, they view the criminal justice system as being there to sort of actually help criminals and ignore the needs of victims and ignore the need for public safety. And it is a growing problem. It's a trend, if you will. And we are working very hard to push back against that trend. And other like-minded individuals and groups are as well, to make sure that the rights of victims are promoted and are held above the rights of people who would victimize others. And that the public safety in general is held above the needs of people who would commit crimes.
So that's fascinating. I ask you, how are criminals doing so well? It's maybe a good time to be a criminal from their perspective. And the answer is not, the organized crime is just so good. The answer is not, the cartels have just outmaneuvered and they have technology. The answer is not that at all. The first words to your answer, public officials. So I think that's really what we've got to dive into here. How can it be that all the crime we're seeing, our cities being less safe, isn't because the criminals have, upped their game. It's because we've changed what we're doing in the public policy level. I want to hear, what is the process? You were in Baltimore. I know Baltimore well. It's just, we're based out of DC. Family Research Council is based out of DC, very near Baltimore. I covered the Baltimore riots, the Freddie Gray Baltimore riots as a reporter. I was injured there, attacked. I got hit in the face with a 40-ounce liquor bottle, spent the night in the hospital, concussion. I was warned many times I shouldn't be there because I was white and that I was in danger, and it proved prophetic. Although I don't know the race of my attacker, I should say that. I was blindsided in a cowardly fashion. So, I'm very acquainted with Baltimore, and does not feel safe there. I mean, I know you probably love the city, you served it, but I've been overseas. I've been to Peru. I've been to Greece. I've even been to Colombia, and I felt more safe there than I felt in Baltimore. And I think this is a common feeling. There's parts of DC where I don't feel safe. How can it be that we're the richest country in the world? We're at least used to be a Christian nation. I think we're still fighting for that identity. We're supposed to be the beacon and the standard to the world of how Western democracy should act. And our own cities don't feel like safe places. What's happening behind the scenes? You're, a police officer in Baltimore. I want to talk about, police misbehavior later, but I think the safety issue has got to be the first thing we talk about.
Yeah, I think it's there is a movement. A movement, I think, is the right way to describe it, that views, and unfortunately, the movement doesn't really come from the community. So picture a community in Baltimore, or really any city that is challenged by crime, where if you live in that community and you don't have the opportunity to get out of that community, and you're an honest and hardworking person, and most people are in those communities, you find it even harder to get out and get ahead because you have the likelihood of being victimized is very high. They have a particular point of view and they want public safety. But there's another point of view that is more powerful, and that is of people who are elite, for lack of a better term, went to the best schools, grew up wealthy or near wealthy, worked for the ACLU, worked for other special interest groups on the left. And
don't live in the dangerous neighborhoods.
And do not live in it, and have never really spent any time in a dangerous neighborhood. You really don't understand the dynamic. You've read about it, you've heard about it in school, and you want to do something about it, but you've been led to believe that there's a solution that really, from my perspective, is absolutely not the solution. And they want to impose this worldview that basically the problem is that, jail is bad. And, in other words, we shouldn't even put our criminals in jail because it makes it worse. That we should prioritize the needs of the people who are out there victimizing others, as I said, over the people who live in the community or just trying to get out and provide for their families and do all the good things that we all want. And that, unfortunately, that movement has taken control in a growing number of cities. I mean, we've calculated about 75, and it's probably actually more than that now, cities and counties in the United States that have elected prosecutors, just as one.
75.
Yeah, 75.
That's a lot of major cities.
It's a lot.
We don't have that many.
Wow. It's a lot. And it's counties too. So like Fairfax County, just near you in DC, just outside of DC, a major American county, wealthy. It's home to many Supreme Court justices, members of Congress make their homes there. It's a prominent county in the United States, and they have a prosecutor that is part of this movement. And that really is the fundamental issue here, is that we have prosecutors who've been placed in office. Oftentimes voters don't really understand, prosecutor races aren't the top of the ticket. So people are thinking about who they're going to vote for president or for governor or other members of Congress, Senate, so forth. They're not often focused on elections for prosecutors. And so, as I know we'll discuss, it doesn't take a lot of money to be injected into a prosecutor's race to cause there to be a winner, even when that winner is coming from a perspective that is antithetical to what most voters and residents of these cities and counties want. It's what they wind up with because of the infusion of money into those races.
Okay, so we've got this. You described the ideology, which is kind of foreign to the way a lot of Americans think about it. We're actually going to talk about what the Bible has to say about this in a minute, but You got this ideology, which is informing all these prosecutors. It's just sort of that jail is punitive. Maybe it doesn't even help. And it's almost maybe immoral to send people to jail. That, when I talk to people, I know some people who work in the criminal justice system who share this view, and they basically believe that the entire system is corrupt, that the American justice system is really just a tool to oppress the poor. And they really believe that. They don't even see hardly any redemptive nature to it. It's kind of shocking when you really hear them say that out loud, because I think most Americans, even many Democrats, this is not just a red versus blue issue. That's why I wanted to talk about it. Is they appreciate police. They understand that, something happens, they're going to call the cops. Sam, I want to ask you, you write about this a lot. Am I just a curmudgeonly, increasingly older guy who thinks that American cities are in decline, or is there something to this as you report about it, in these riots and the crime and different things? Is this a real problem from your reporting and perspective, or am I making too much of this?
No, it's definitely become a widespread issue, and not just like major. It used to be maybe even like 5 years ago, the concept was these major urban metropolitan areas were the most heavily affected by things of this sort. But it's spread, especially due to the influx in illegal immigration. It's spread to small towns. You look at like Springfield in Ohio. You look at Charleroi in Pennsylvania. Any of these places that you wouldn't know the name of it unless President Trump happened to bring it up during the debate, and then everybody goes and Googles it. These are tiny little places, but they've been tremendously impacted by all of this, and this rising crime. And of course, it doesn't just stay in the cities. It may start or burgeon in the cities, then it spreads outside the cities. I'm from Maryland, and I know I'm sure Jason can probably attest to this. There was, at least, and I think still is, a bit of an opioid crisis, and in where I'm from, Carroll County, you have a lot of people who would get involved with this would end up kind of coalescing in the county chair, which was Westminster, and they'd end up then spreading from there even further. So areas like just north of Westminster, Tawnytown, which is maybe 20 minutes from the border with Pennsylvania, didn't have any crime issue or drug issue or a big problem until you started having a lot of these people who show up for court appointments in Westminster for opioid problems end up going 10 minutes up the road into Tawnytown, and then you've got a drug problem, a crime problem in this tiny little small town area. So it's, I think, a big issue and a burgeoning issue, and we're seeing now some of the more extreme side of things with some of the riots, and the violence, especially against law enforcement, is astounding.
Yeah, it is. And you bring up a great point about immigration, because these things are kind of networking together. You have a whole wing. It's not the entire Democratic Party by any stretch, but you have a wing within the party that believes, in the same way it might be immoral to jail someone for anything other than maybe murder, that deporting people is immoral. They just think it's wrong. And so they really don't agree with many of our laws, and they think it's more moral to not enforce them. So you have these sanctuary cities where you have illegal immigrants flocking to, and then not only are they not deported, but if they're arrested for another crime, they might get out. So, Jason, I think, myself included, a lot of people don't understand. They've never been arrested, or they've never been processed for any kind of serious crime. I've got my share of parking tickets for sure. But from their perspective, law and order is very much in effect. I mean, I get parking tickets. If I speed, I'm going to get pulled over by a cop. Sometimes if I don't speed, even I get a speeding ticket from a camera, which is unconstitutional in my opinion, a whole other episode. But if I run into somebody hit and run, and there's a camera picture taken of me, I think I would expect to be, that be followed up. And so I think the average law-abiding American, their daily experience is that they are subject to law and order. They are subject to the laws of the land. They have a healthy respect and maybe fear of police officers. You see a cop down the street, you slow down. And so it's kind of jarring and shocking when it seems like there's this group of people in society who are not scared of the law, and they seem to get away with a lot of things that most Americans would never think about doing. So what's going on behind the scenes? If you get arrested with like for bond, for instance, if you're a criminal who's fortunate enough to get a liberal Soros funded prosecutor, what can you expect for bond, for maybe charges being dismissed that you would not get if you're some good old fashioned Texas lawman prosecutor or something? What are the two sort of standards of justice? Because it seems like they're coexisting. You said 25 major city of the 50 biggest cities. Okay, so the other 25, what are the two standards and experiences of criminals in a kind of the technical legal sense?
Well, let me just say first, I think one of the things that most law-abiding citizens, like you talk about, people who are just trying to support their families and go to work and maybe have a healthy fear or avoidance of law.
Sure, no, you can use that word. I think it's
because it's not something that they want anything to do with, and that's normal actually. But I think one of the things that people take for granted is they think that when people are arrested for a crime, like for stealing a car, like for example, that means they're going to go to jail. And the truth is,
obviously, no, of course. How can I want you to finish? But of course, that intro phrase. Well, most people might think if you steal a car, you're going to jail. But like, I cannot imagine what's coming after this, Jason. But continue.
I think you can. The reality is you're not. And so when people, and I don't necessarily mean these prosecutors because they know better, but the general public, even people on the left who tend to be what we now call decarcerationists, or they think too many people go to jail, and all that is. I don't think they have a real sense of how the criminal justice system works. That basically very few people go to jail. Very few people who are arrested and charged with a crime ultimately are sentenced to a term of incarceration. And when they are, it's really for those really serious crimes, things like robbery and rape and murder and attempted murder. Those are the people that are going to jail. The stories about people going to jail for like a small quantity of marijuana or even drugs generally, they really don't. For thefts, even stealing a car, or you see people going and they grab an armload of clothes at the Lululemon or something and run out. They're not going to jail. Okay, so and that's just the way, and the system has been that way for a while. And not that there aren't certain jurisdictions in the United States where you actually might go to jail for that, but in the majority of the United States, regardless of red state, blue state, you're just not going to jail for that sort of offense. So really, we're only talking about people in a pretty narrow set of circumstances that ultimately could be incarcerated regardless of the predilections of the local prosecutor. So in the jurisdictions that have a, what we would call a progressive prosecutor or a Soros-funded prosecutor, they really don't want anyone to go to jail. So, you've got anecdotes of people who've been arrested 90 plus times who then get charged with robbery, which robbery is a violent crime. Robbery is when you put a gun in someone's face or use force on them and to take property from them. That's a violent crime.
Yes, I had a friend whose pregnant wife was robbed at gunpoint in D.C. and it was definitely violent, whether the trigger's pulled or not.
It's life-changing for the victim.
Yeah.
This is not something like, oh, well, they got my wallet. No, people have ongoing, lingering post-traumatic stress. People are not accustomed to being on the so the receiving end of that sort of force or threat of force. And so this is a very big deal. It should be treated as a big deal, but I don't know anything about your friend whose wife was robbed, but I'll bet you if they identified the suspect, that suspect didn't do any time in jail. And that's the unfortunate reality that we're dealing with. I mean, unless this offense occurred since January 20th of 2025, things might be different in that case, but outside of that, no. So the difference really is that we're really focusing on a pretty narrow set of circumstances. I mean, these are, violent, serious offenses like carjacking, shooting, murder, these sorts of things, where a traditional prosecutor would absolutely want you to be incarcerated for that, if for no other reason, to protect the public. Because if you've shown you're willing to do this,
that's a great reason. That's a great reason.
You're dangerous. So
yeah,
there's all kinds of look, if you get into the theory of incarceration, there's all sorts of reasons why it would be a good thing. Some of those are, to reform the person. Jail is supposed to give you opportunities to learn new skills so that you're employable, so you don't resort to crime. But also, one of the often forgotten reasons, especially for these Soros prosecutors, is incapacitation, to get you off the street so you can't victimize again. That's a valid reason. And they completely ignore it. They do not believe that people should go to jail. And that, in some cases, is a huge, huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't have to assume all your theological views, Jason, but in traditional Christian thought, there's an understanding that people have evil within them inherently. We're depraved. We have a kind of evil in us. And of course, we're capable of good as well, because we're made in the image of God. But I think part of this is a different worldview from a lot of people who they don't believe in evil, really. They believe that things are disadvantageous or unfortunate or sad, but they don't believe that evil really exists and that a person can give themselves over that evil and honestly just be irredeemable apart from a miraculous, salvation experience or something. Some people really just give themselves over to a life of crime, and that's what they're going to do. And if you let them out, and we see all these stories, you let them out the same day they commit a crime. It's just become who they are, and I understand the compassion of it, but we have to have a biblical worldview on the idea that we all have evil inside of us and are capable of that. And apart from the grace of God, we would be there too. And so we're trying to hold this evil at bay and protect the innocent first and foremost. Like my friend's pregnant wife. How about her? What about her rights? What about, what about what's best for her, let alone what's best for some MS-13 gang member? But, we're talking about lawlessness here too. We're kind of weaving a few threads. We talk about the ideology driving this, how it works behind the scenes with prosecutors, and then this kind of developing lawlessness. I think it started with getting, drug offenses, not taking them as seriously. But as you said, Jason, it's really spread to a lot of violent offenses, which, by the way, those drug offenses were often a plea deal. So a guy robbed someone and he had a little marijuana on him, and they knock off the robbery charge and they just charge him for possession. And then 5 years later, some, theorist says, oh, look at this guy put in jail for a nonviolent drug offense. And it's like, no, that was a plea deal made where they knocked down his violent charges, whatever. Sam, speaking of lawlessness, you've been covering these riots. Are people going to jail for clearing out Macy's or Forever 21 and filling their car with the latest Zara merchandise? There's a famous Twitter video of during the LA riots of people just clearing out a Zara in the name of protesting immigration. What's going on? Are people going to jail for this?
Yeah, I hope they're going to jail. Some of the Trump administration and the Trump Justice Department are bringing federal charges against some of these people. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, she's talked about using, federal legislation to actually target organized looting and, kind of like group looting, group crimes like that. Mm-hmm. They've arrested a number of people who've, violently assaulted federal agents and LAPD officers and such. I don't actually know that anybody's stood trial yet or actually gone to jail, but they are bringing charges in at least some cases. The chief focus, I think, certainly with the riots right now is basically crowd control, just kind of making sure that federal agents can do what they're in LA to do and other areas. Cause you've got, riots breaking out in Seattle, in Portland, and even in places like Omaha, like you wouldn't think of Omaha as like, some hub of, left-wing illegal immigration, activism, but they've got, protests breaking out in Omaha. They had, some riots down in areas in Texas, New York City. They did, I think it was Saturday, they did something like almost 100 arrests in Manhattan. Out of, they had plenty of other people who they may still bring charges against, but right then and there were, I think it was like 84 or 85 people they arrested right on the spot for violent and disorderly conduct, for attacking police officers. So it's, you talk about lawlessness. It is, this spreading phenomenon. And I think that, if talking about, what Jason said about this idea of kind of like viewing incarceration as kind of like unfair or, an evil in itself, I think of this bit from C.S. Lewis where he has a character in one of his novels who is a former police officer, talk about kind of a new way of treating law enforcement and punishment, and saying that if you call it remedial, rehabilitative, you can do whatever you want with it. If you call it punitive, if the idea of going to jail is punitive, that means it's deserved. There is a finite limit to it. You can only punish someone so much before it becomes an injustice. Whereas rehabilitating someone or repairing someone, there's no limit to that. They can go as far as they want, with anything, experiments, keeping people, doing things with them. So I think that you have this approach to not just prosecuting the crimes, but then you see how that is kind of lived out or played out with stuff like these riots. Because, if maybe smoking pot or selling pot or whatever isn't a big offense, that isn't a big deal. Maybe, taking what I want from whatever Lululemon, is not a big deal either. And if that's not a big deal, then maybe, shooting a firework at a police officer isn't a big deal. If that's not a big deal, coming into the country illegally and murdering someone, maybe that's not a big deal either.
Yeah, you probably remember in school when you had a substitute teacher come into class, right? And everyone knew when you walked into class as a kid and you had a substitute teacher that it was time to act up a little bit, because this substitute teacher just wasn't going to have the same gravitas, the same authority, the same relationship to lay down the law of the land. And they were basically just kind of trying to manage the chaos, and you could get away with a lot more. Maybe you guys were more Boy Scouts than me, but I just knew, oh, this is time. It's time to cut up and make jokes. And the class inevitably descended into chaos because we knew the substitute teacher didn't really have the authority. And it really released kind of a lawlessness in the class. And I think because of, several things, one, not enforcing our immigration laws, purposefully not doing that. It's not that we need another bill. As President Trump famously said at his State of the Union, he said, they said we needed another legislation. Turns out all we needed was a new president. We just needed to actually enforce the laws we had on the books. And we've totally shut down the border. And now they're working on deporting the people who need to get out of here. I think the latest number I saw is about 75% of those being deported have like active criminal charges against them or a criminal history. So that's underway. But because we purposely didn't enforce that law, it creates this sort of substitute teacher. How serious is the law really? And then it got worse in the 2020 Black Lives Matter riots. And I'd love to hear you, Jason, talk about how that impacted even the psychology of police officers and morale. But those guys didn't go to jail. I mean, they burned down cities all over the country. And while, if you run a red light, you get a ticket. But these guys burned down entire cities. I was in Baltimore where they burned down I believe it was a CVS. And pretty much the guy who attacked me, nobody went to jail. There's a few people here and there picked up. But there was not even real resources put into it because it was just seen as it was a political thing. And you can't let all these cities burn and then all these illegal immigrants come in with no repercussions. And then you hear all these anecdotal stories about people who were arrested and let go. And at a certain point, you just lose respect for the rule of law. And, Jason, you as a police officer know that what protects you from having to exert force is this kind of healthy respect for who you are as a police officer. I mean, I know I've known some police officers, law enforcement, DEA, and part of the reason for, the badge, the uniform, speaking in an authoritative tone is actually to shut things down quickly without having to escalate, because there's a respect for you as an officer. There's a respect for the rule of law. You take control of the situation and you handle it peacefully. But if everyone, I think some people are always going to kind of hate the police because of rebellion in the human heart, but they can hate it and still respect it. And if they don't respect it, and don't have like a healthy fear, it's going to actually lead to more violence and more people resisting arrest. And you see these videos where then they end up getting shot or tased, and there's a whole case. So Jason, what do you think about that? I mean, am I off base? And how did the just letting the BLM riots run rampant affect police morale in the ensuing, few years we've seen? I mean, I know it increased violent crime, but how did it affect police?
It devastated police morale pretty much everywhere, to the point where, there's the immediate impact of surging crime. And there was,
right.
And we actually measured that. I'll talk more about that in a second. Crime surged in 2020, most categories of crime. And the most reliable category of crime, I've learned this over decades of being involved in this policing and criminal justice stuff, is the two most reliable crime stats are murder, because You can't do anything with those murder numbers. There's mayors and police chiefs have a big incentives, and many others as well, have a big incentive to make crime look like it's getting better, even when it's not.
Right.
You can't do much with the homicide numbers.
When there's a body.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. There's no way you can make it go away, although they try. And then there's the auto theft number, and that's because insurance claims are made on auto thefts, and you can't act like it didn't happen because somebody made an insurance claim because they got their car stolen. And so those tend to be two of the more reliable numbers. So those are really what you look at. If you're looking at violent crime, look at the homicide number. If you're looking at crime against property, look at the auto theft numbers and potentially carjacking numbers. But homicide numbers went up in 2020 pretty much everywhere. Some places significantly, 70% in 1 year increase. And so at the same time, what we learned from studying, as my organization, a Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, we actually published a study on this very recently where we retrospectively looked at this data. We looked at the crime numbers, and then we looked at measures of police productivity. So when you think about a hardworking police officer, what do you think about them doing? You think about them making arrests, right? If you're out there looking for criminals, you're probably going to find them, and you're probably going to make an arrest, or at least a traffic stop, or a stop of a suspicious person. Traditionally, that's how we kind of measured how productive our law enforcement officers are and how much work they're doing. And what we found was those numbers move in opposite directions. So the measures of police productivity in 2020 went down very sharply for all the reasons you cited. Police are on the defensive. They're being discouraged from actually going out and looking for criminals. They're sidetracked with riots and so forth. And at the same time, the homicide numbers are going up. And what we found was that same dynamic was at play across the country. And then as the years went on, leading up to 2025, you see police productivity is starting to move up again. We see police officers re-engaged, not everywhere, not in every city, but it's certainly in many cities. They're making arrests again. They're stopping people who are suspicious and who are engaged in criminal activity. And you know what we saw? I mean, probably you could answer the question. When we saw that happen, we saw police back re-engaged. We saw our best measure of violent crime, homicides, going down. And at the same time. So, obviously you can't answer the question of why did homicides come down with just one answer, like, well, the police got back in. Obviously, there are other explanations as well. There are other reasons. But that's one of them. And we see that all the time. We see those two dynamics working all the time. And so we know that one of the things that we can do to reduce crime, especially violent crime, is we can have an adequately staffed, motivated, well-trained, well-functioning law enforcement agency, the police department, the front line of crime fighting. And that's critical. And we lost that. And right now we have every law enforcement agency in the country is hiring. I don't care what city you're in. You will see ads on TV. You will see ads in the newspaper. You'll see Facebook ads and everywhere.
Are they having trouble recruiting?
Yes, because
of this.
Because of really the way the police profession has been portrayed, really since 2020. But you could argue from 2015. There were many 2020s before 2020. There was in 2015. There was a few cities. Baltimore was one of them. And the riots you described that you were actually covering for 2015 in Baltimore. And there were 2015 riots in Chicago. And then in 2018, there were another volley of, right. And then 2020 was the biggest one. I mean, 2020 was really where it became so widespread at one time. But in each of these events, locally and then nationally in 2020, we saw pressure against, like, unprecedented pressure against law enforcement that led to these really, really difficult recruitment challenges that these cities face. And the most fundamental reason for it is this. If you are a young person and you're interested in a career in law enforcement, but then all of a sudden that career that you had idealized, that you had said, that is, a law enforcement officer is a lot of things. You're a leader in your community. You set a good example. You're respected. As long as you earn the respect, you'll be respected traditionally. And then all that was taken away, and they said, no, don't respect. these authority figures, that they're actually bad, they're not good. And that is the message that has been, pumped out through popular media and through on social media that so many young people are influenced by. And so it just didn't have the same luster it had. That's the reason that I was attracted to law enforcement, or one of the reasons is that it seems like a way to do good, in so many different ways. And they took that away. And so, people ask me what needs to happen. I was like, it's very simple. It really is simple, is that the people who have influence in our culture have to speak out about the positives of law enforcement. And as a career, as a profession, that it really is a good thing. It's a good thing to do if you want to create a positive force in your community. And so I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the same thing with the Army recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
When the Army was all about just, a transgender education camp and taking, cadets being forced to take DEI trainings, and the advertisements for the Army were like, be careful with my language, but just almost feminist in nature or something. You're not going to recruit a bunch of young men to come and lay down their lives for that. It's not because it's about honor. And I think people, young men in particular, really crave that honor culture. And that's what football is about. That's why football is so powerful. It's an honor culture. It's extremely difficult to play high school football, especially at least in Texas where I grew up. I mean, we practiced twice a day, or just the things we did to be on that team. Now I can't believe it. But you know what? You were on the football team, and it was an honor to be on the team, and people knew you were on the team. And on Friday or whatever, you got to wear that jersey, and people ask you about the big game coming up. And even if you didn't play, even if you rode the bench the whole time, you were on the team, and there's honor to that. And young men are very susceptible and interested in that, and it's a good thing. So when we dishonor these positions where, that do deserve honor because you risk your lives for the safety of the community, I think you're exactly right, Jason. I want to talk about what Trump is doing, and we bring you in on this topic too, Sam. But first, I want to name some names because sometimes this topic gets talked about so generally. So when we talk about these prosecutors who are fueling this, and we're going to talk about what President Trump is, doing to change it. But, I have some numbers, and this is from, thanks for giving me these, Jason. But, Jody Owens, Hinds County in Mississippi, $500,000 from Soros. And sometimes it comes from a Soros group because George Soros has like all these groups that he and other people fund. There's like a network of shell companies or just actual, nonprofits doing similar things. They're disconnected. So it might look like 5 different groups gave to this person, but the money is coming from the same place usually. We have, Orange County, Arlington County, Virginia, where I used to live. Ulster County, New York, David Clegg, Shalina Jones, in Clatham County, Georgia, got almost 150,000. Jason Williams in Orleans Parish, Louisiana, got 220,000. Pamela Price in Alameda County, California, got nearly $1 million. Noah Phillips. These are just the recent ones. So there's more than these. You said 25 cities, 75.
Alvin,
how many? 70?
Manhattan was over $1 million.
Alvin Bragg, who notoriously prosecuted the president of the United States in a lawfare campaign. Turns out he was funded by this Hungarian-American billionaire and others, who in this Politico article is shocking that came out a few years ago. And I'll read the headline. It said, George Soros, quiet overhaul of the U.S. justice system. And I read that Politico, I read the Politico article because I think when people hear Soros, sometimes they say, oh, here comes the right-wing conspiracy. But everything I'm reading to you are numbers. They're data. They're not, my buddy at the Pentagon, who I can't say his name, told me this. We're not doing that. We're reading you numbers that are publicly available, telling you what Politico said. Politico said that George Soros is overhauling the U.S. justice system. I don't remember voting on that. I don't know if you guys remember voting on that happening in our, representative democracy. But Sam, Jason, maybe you could start. What is President Trump doing since taking office? Maybe how he's handling the riots differently. And then Jason, I would love to hear about how he's taking on consent decrees.
Yeah, with the riots, one of the big things is he's called in, he's federalized the California National Guard, which has been very controversial, probably more controversial than arguably it should have been. We do have a lot of precedent for U.S. presidents doing that in the past and deploying federal troops, both U.S. Army and U.S. Marine, domestically and to assist or aid in domestic law enforcement or riot control, etc. Is actually I wrote about it at Washington Stand for us. There is a lot of precedent for that. U.S. presidents have done that multiple times, even just in recent history within the last decade. They've done that several times to address Vietnam War protests or race riots or civil rights unrest. So it's not this unprecedented dictatorial move. I mean, John F. Kennedy did it, and he's not typically remembered as one of our more autocratic presidents. Nobody puts him on a par with Hitler. But he's federalized the California National Guard and deployed U.S. Marines. And to federalize the National Guard, he overstepped Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, which is kind of a big deal. He wasn't, asked, hey, Mr. President, can you please come in here and help me out? Newsom was just like earlier this year with the wildfires in LA. He's been kind of content to let the city burn, and so Trump has decided that he is going to step in. So he is working on, and we've seen it at the border as well, with an over 90% drop in border crossings, border encounters, border expulsions, etc. He is enforcing the law. We actually have laws on the books, like you pointed out earlier, Casey. He said, all that we needed was a new president. We didn't need this new legislation. We already have the laws. We just need people with the will and with the moral fiber to enforce those laws and to back those laws. And he's doing that, and he's, for the most part, putting people in positions where he can, who are going to do the same thing, who are going to enforce that law, whether it's in the Justice Department or Department of Homeland Security, even just in the White House, his advisors on policy issues, people like Stephen Miller, who crafted his immigration policy. These are people who are willing to actually address these issues, enforce the law, even when it's unpopular. You look at someone like Tom Homan. I saw a video, I guess maybe a month ago, of him walking through the Capitol building, and just casually eating an apple. And you've got all these protesters lined up, and they're all screaming at him, and he's just smiling, eating his apple, walking by them. He doesn't care. He knows that he's enforcing the law, that we have laws, that they are just, and that his duty, his responsibility is to make sure that those laws are followed, whether people are going to cry about it or not, And so Trump's kind of stacking his administration with people who are willing to do that, people who are going to enforce the laws that we actually have on the books.
Right. It's crazy that it's taken such backbone just to restore what was normal 30 years ago. Yeah. Jason, I want you to explain consent decrees to us. I understand that the Biden administration, and I don't think it was just them, but in this great sort of kind of sometimes a persecution of local police departments, animated by this sort of belief that pretty much all cops are evil at some level or racist at some level and therefore evil and need to be reined in and closely monitored by the federal government. The DOJ has put all of these, often be welcomed by the local city council, by the way, which is often very liberal, and that's part of interesting complexity here. But the DOJ has put these strict rules and monitoring on local police departments to make sure that there's no racial disparities. And by the way, they interpret disparities as inherently racist, regardless of the motive. So if more people of a certain race were arrested in a city, instead of saying, well, maybe that those people committed more crimes, they say there must be racism. But what has President Trump done since taking office? The DOJ, I know Harmeet Dillon's involved, to take on the consent decree issue.
Yeah, just a little tiny bit of background on consent decrees. I mean, consent decrees are a tool that the Justice Department, typically the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, has to remedy a pattern or practice of constitutional violations by a state or local law enforcement agency. And so in theory, that kind of makes sense. If you had a local local government agency that was repeatedly and as a pattern or practice violating constitutional rights, and you could establish that through an investigation, then it gives the federal Department of Justice the ability to go in and remedy those violations by certain reforms that the police department would be required to implement. And so, I mean, in theory, it makes some sense why you might want to have that. The problem is beginning really in the Obama administration, and then took a 4-year pause during the Trump 45 administration, and then was back on during Biden's term, was just absolute over entanglement of the federal government and local law enforcement, to the point where if there was any controversial incident, a singular incident involving any law enforcement agency. So we all know of law enforcement agencies that have had at least a singular incident in which they were cast in a negative light, either deservedly or not. Minneapolis and Chicago, Baltimore, you name it. And there's a handful of cities. Phoenix is another one that becomes important in the conversation. The Civil Rights Division launches this pattern of practice investigation. They send teams of lawyers into these local cities, agencies, and they look under every stone. I mean, they are given broad access to the department, records, personnel, you name it. And then they typically take about a year to do that, sometimes a little bit more, and they're very, very thorough. And then they issue findings of what they found, and without any exception, during the Obama administration and during the Biden administration, every time they launched an investigation, I'm going to let you guys guess at what they found. They say they found a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. And the remedies that they propose are just so vast and almost unachievable, extremely expensive, extremely burdensome, and have a real negative impact on the agency's ability to fight crime. They basically hamstring the agency and bury them in bureaucracy and review. And I've seen it up close myself, how it works, and it's just completely ineffective. It's politically popular in parts of the left, and that's why they do it. Activists push it. There are monitors. The court appoints an independent monitor, which is not a part of the government. It's just an independent group of experts who have to monitor the implementation of the decree, and they get paid. And the city,
well paid.
They get paid very well. And the city bears the cost for that. So on top of having to implement the reforms, which are costly, they also have to pay the monitor. And of course, the monitor is incentivized to extend out the implementation of the consent decree for as long as possible. They're getting millions and millions of dollars for overseeing it. So there's just many, many problems. We've written about it quite a bit at Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. Other groups have as well. And to get to your actual question, the Trump administration has really done a great job, especially just recently in the last month or so. Pam Bondi, who's the Attorney General, brought in Harmeet Dillon, who is Assistant Attorney General, I think is her title, but she oversees the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. Very, very high level position, Senate confirmed position. And I think she recognized just starting to look at the issue at the problems with these consent decrees that we've written about extensively, and have basically pulled back. There are certain consent decrees that are already in place that remain in place, because a consent decree, once a court puts a consent decree in place, it's not as if one party can just come in and undo it. But the investigations that were underway that had during Biden, they had pushed for consent decrees in certain jurisdictions, Minneapolis being probably chief among them. The Trump Department of Justice has essentially walked away from them and said, we don't believe the consent decrees are the way to do it. It doesn't mean that police reform isn't needed in some cases. Certainly it is in some cases, but really it should be driven locally by state and local officials to bring their departments up to speed on whatever they should be doing in terms of policy, training, and the like. And the federal government really doesn't have a role in it. They just make it worse, basically. And so fortunately, good news there from the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be a constitutional question, too, of how the federal government can have so much control over local police. I mean, local police are supposed to be independent for a reason. They cannot become an extension of the executive branch. That's part of how we preserve freedom in our country. As we kind of come to the end here, I want to do something we don't always do. I'm going to read from the scripture, Romans 13, because I think it's very relevant, and it goes back to earlier in our conversation. It says in verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So I know that's a very highly unpopular way of thinking about this issue in some parts of our country and political discourse, and even maybe people who would agree with some of the line of thinking here won't bring that up. But I bring it up because while we can talk about the policies and things all day, and they're very important, and consent decrees and how they're abused and how outside money maybe, is polluting the prosecutor process, I think there's a spirit of lawlessness that's been released in the country by allowing the riots, by not prosecuting shoplifters. I mean, they just walk in and out. We've all seen the videos, by not closing the border for so many years. And we have to have a restoration of a healthy fear, not an unhealthy. I mean, we're still Americans. We fought a revolution for our freedom, but a healthy respect and fear for law enforcement and for the authorities, which the scripture says are for our own good when they're rightly balanced and the checks are there. And I do believe they're there. And we're always working to improve that. But we've got to have the healthy fear and the healthy respect, as it says in Romans. And when that's all working well, it's for our good. And the real victims here are actually the regular law-abiding citizens in the community. It's not the well-paid activists who are getting paid all this money to monitor consent decrees. It's not the criminals who are getting their sentences knocked down or the illegal immigrants who are not getting deported. It's my friend's pregnant wife who's held at gunpoint and can't even feel in front of her own home, not in some, somewhere like midnight in a bad neighborhood or something. It's regular people who are paying the price. And so we just want to have clarity on this. We want to have a biblical worldview, and we want to balance compassion for those who have broken the law with wisdom and the righteousness that is offered to us. But we're out of time. I'm Jason Johnson from LELDF. Thanks so much for joining us. And Sam for the Washington Stand. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to dive into this issue.
Thanks for having me, Casey. It's been great. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, you can like and subscribe, follow us, and check out our reporting on thewashingtonstand.com. I am your host of the Outstanding Podcast, Casey Harper. We have new episodes coming out each week, so check back in with us.
Outstanding is a production of The Washington Stand, your source for news and commentary from a biblical worldview. Our technical producers are Yusef Fletcher and David Salkeld. Our guest coordinator and production assistant is Rachel Woods. Our executive producer is Jared Bridges. Help support this podcast by texting the word OUTSTANDING to 67742 and read more at WashingtonStand.com.